trying to say is this. In times of peace, just as many people die per 1,000 between the ages of 50 and 55 as were killed per 1,000 among the 163,000 soldiers who fought at Gettysburg. I wrote several chapters of this book at James Simpson's Numtigaw Lodge on the shores of Bow Lake in the Canadian Rockies. While stopping there one summer, I met Mr. and Mrs. Herbert H. Salinger of San Francisco. Mrs. Salinger, a poised, serene woman, gave me the impression that she had never worried. One evening, in front of the roaring fireplace, I asked her if she had ever been troubled by worry. "Troubled by it," she said. "My life was almost ruined by it. Before I learned to conquer worry, I lived through 11 years of self-made hell. I was irritable and hot-tempered. I lived under terrific tension. I would take the bus every week from my home in San Mateo to shop in San Francisco. But even while shopping, I worried myself into a dither. Maybe I had left the electric iron connected on the ironing board. Maybe the house had caught fire. Maybe the maid had run off and left the children. Maybe they had been out on their bicycles and been killed by a car. In the midst of my shopping, I would often worry myself into a cold perspiration and rush out and take the bus home to see if everything was all right. No wonder my first marriage ended in disaster. My second husband is a lawyer, a quiet, analytical man who never worries about anything. When I became tense and anxious, he would say to me, "Relax, let's think this thing out. What are you really worrying about? Let's examine the law of averages and see whether or not it is likely to happen." For example, I remember the time we were driving from Albuquerque, New Mexico, to the Carlsbad Caverns, driving on a dirt road when we were caught in a terrible rainstorm. The car was slithering and sliding. We couldn't control it. I was positive we would slide off into one of the ditches that flanked the road, but my husband kept repeating to me, "I am driving very slowly. Nothing serious is likely to happen. Even if the car does slide into the ditch, by the law of averages, we won't be hurt." His calmness and confidence quieted me. One summer, we were on a camping trip in the Token Valley of the Canadian Rockies. One night, we were camping 7,000 feet above sea level when a storm threatened to tear our tent to shreds. The tents were tied with guy ropes to a wooden platform. The outer tent shook and trembled and screamed and shrieked in the wind. I expected every minute to see our tent torn loose and hurled through the sky. I was terrified. But my husband kept saying, "Look, my dear, we are traveling with Brewster's guides. Brewsters know what they're doing. They've been pitching tents in these mountains for 60 years. This tent has been here for many seasons. It hasn't blown down yet, and by the law of averages, it won't blow away tonight. And even if it does, we can take shelter in another tent. So relax." I did, and I slept soundly the balance of the night. A few years ago, an infantile paralysis epidemic swept over our part of California. In the old days, I would have been hysterical, but my husband persuaded me to act calmly. We took all the precautions we could. We kept our children away from crowds, away from school and the movies. By consulting the Board of Health, we found out that even during the worst infantile paralysis epidemic that California had ever known up to that time, only 1,835 children had been stricken in the entire state of California, and that the usual number was around 200 or 300. Tragic as those figures are, we nevertheless felt that, according to the law of averages, the chances of any one child being stricken were remote. By the law of averages, it won't happen. That phrase has destroyed 90% of my worries and has made the past 20 years of my life beautiful and peaceful beyond my highest expectations. It has been said that nearly all of our worries and unhappiness come from our imagination and not from reality. As I look back across the decades, I can see that is where most of my worries came from also. Jim Grant told me that had been his experience, too. He owned the James A. Grant Distributing Company of New York City. He ordered from 10 to 15 carloads of Florida oranges and grapefruit at a time. He told me that he used to torture himself with such thoughts as, what if there's a train wreck? What if my fruit is strewn all over the countryside? What if a bridge collapses as my cars are going over it? Of course, the fruit was insured, but he feared that if he didn't deliver his fruit on time, he might risk the loss of his market. He worried so much that he feared he had stomach ulcers and went to a doctor. The doctor told him there was nothing wrong with him except jumpy nerves. I saw the light then, he said, and began to ask myself questions. I said to myself, "Look here, Jim Grant, how many fruit cars have you handled over the years?" The answer was about 25,000. Then I asked myself, how many of those cars were ever wrecked? The answer was, maybe 5. Then I said to myself, only 5 out of 25,000. Do you know what that means? A ratio of 5,000 to 1. In other words, by the law of averages, based on experience, the chances are 5,000 to 1 against one of your cars ever being wrecked. So, what are you worried about? And then I said to myself, well, a bridge may collapse. Then I asked myself, how many cars have you actually lost from a bridge collapsing? The answer was none. Then I said to myself, aren't you a fool to be worrying yourself into stomach ulcers over a bridge which has never yet collapsed and over a railroad wreck when the chances are 5,000 to 1 against it? When I looked at it that way, Jim Grant told me, I felt pretty silly. I decided then and there to let the law of averages do the worrying for me, and I have not been troubled with my stomach ulcer since. When Al Smith was governor of New York, I heard him answer the attacks of his political enemies by saying over and over, "Let's examine the record. Let's examine the record." Then he proceeded to give the facts. The next time you and I are worrying about what may happen, let's take a tip from wise old Al Smith. Let's examine the record and see what basis there is, if any, for our gnawing anxieties. That's precisely what Frederick J. Malstead did when he feared he was lying in his grave. Here's his story as he told it to one of our classes in New York. Early in June 1944, I was lying in a slit trench near Omaha Beach. I was with the 999th Signal Service Company. We'd just dug in Normandy. As I looked around to that slit trench, just a rectangular hole in the ground, I said to myself, this looks just like a grave. When I lay down and tried to sleep in it, it felt like a grave. I couldn't help saying to myself, maybe this is my grave. When the German bombers began coming over at 11 p.m. and the bombs started falling, I was scared stiff. For the first 2 or 3 nights I couldn't sleep at all. By the 4th or 5th night I was almost a nervous wreck. I knew that if I didn't do something I would go stark crazy. So I reminded myself that 5 nights had passed and I was still alive, and so was every man in our outfit. Only 2 had even been injured, and they had been hurt not by the German bombs, but by falling flak from our own anti-aircraft guns. I decided to stop worrying by doing something constructive. So I built a thick wooden roof over my slit trench to protect myself from flak. I thought of the vast area over which my unit was spread. I told myself that the only way I could be killed in that deep, narrow slit trench was by a direct hit. And I figured out that the chance of a direct hit on me was not 1 in 10,000. After a couple of nights of looking at it in this way, I calmed down and slept even through the bomb raids. The United States Navy used the statistics of the law of averages to buck up the morale of their men. One ex-sailor told me that when he and his shipmates were assigned to high-octane tankers, they were worried stiff. They all believed that if a tanker loaded with high-octane gasoline was hit by a torpedo, it exploded and blew everybody to kingdom come. But the U.S. Navy knew otherwise. So the Navy issued exact figures, showing that out of 100 tankers hit by torpedoes, 60 stayed afloat. And of the 40 that did sink, only 5 sank in less than 10 minutes. That meant time to get off the ship. It also meant casualties were exceedingly small. Did this help morale? This knowledge of the law of averages wiped out my jitters, said Clyde W. Moss of St. Paul, Minnesota, the man who told the story. The whole crew felt better. We knew we had a chance, and that by the law of averages we probably wouldn't be killed. To break the worry habit before it breaks you, here is Rule 3. Let's examine the record. Let's ask ourselves, what are the chances? according to the law of averages, that this event I am worrying about will ever occur. Chapter 9. Cooperate with the Inevitable. When I was a little boy, I was playing with some of my friends in the attic of an old abandoned log house in northwest Missouri. As I climbed down out of the attic, I rested my feet on a windowsill for a moment and then jumped. I had a ring on my left forefinger, and as I jumped, the ring caught on a nail head and tore off my finger. I screamed. I was terrified. I was positive I was going to die. But after the hand healed, I never worried about it for one split second. What would have been the use? I accepted the inevitable. And now I often go for a month at a time without even thinking about the fact that I have only 3 fingers and a thumb on my left hand. A few years ago, I met a man who was running a freight elevator in one of the downtown office buildings in New York. I noticed that his left hand had been cut off at the wrist. I asked him if the loss of that hand bothered him. He said, "Oh, no, I hardly ever think about it. I'm not married. The only time I ever think about it is when I try to thread a needle." It's astonishing how quickly we can accept almost any situation, if we have to, and adjust ourselves to it and forget about it. I often think of an inscription on the ruins of a 15th century cathedral in Amsterdam, Holland. This inscription says in Flemish, "It is so. It cannot be otherwise." As you and I march across the decades of time, we're going to meet a lot of unpleasant situations that are so. They cannot be otherwise. We have our choice. We can either accept them as inevitable and adjust ourselves to them, or we can ruin our lives with rebellion and maybe end up with a nervous breakdown. Here's a bit of sage advice from one of my favorite philosophers, William James. "Be willing to have it so," he said. "Acceptance of what has happened is the first step to overcoming the consequences of any misfortune." Elizabeth Conley of Portland, Oregon, had to find that out the hard way. Here's a letter that she wrote me. "On the very day that America was celebrating the victory of our armed forces in North Africa," the letter says, "I received a telegram from the War Department. My nephew, the person I loved most, was missing in action. A short time later, another telegram arrived saying he was dead. I was prostrate with grief. Up to that time, I had felt that life had been very good to me. I had a job I loved. I'd helped to raise this nephew. He represented to me all that was fine and good in young manhood. I'd felt that all the bread I had cast upon the waters was coming back to me as cake. Then came this telegram. My whole world collapsed. I felt there was nothing left to live for. I neglected my work, neglected my friends. I let everything go. I was bitter and resentful. Why did my loving nephew have to be taken? Why did this good boy, with life all before him, why did he have to be killed? I couldn't accept it. My grief was so overwhelming that I decided to give up my work and go away and hide myself in tears and bitterness. I was clearing out my desk, getting ready to quit, when I came across a letter that I had forgotten, a letter from this nephew who had been killed, a letter he'd written to me when my mother had died a few years ago. "Of course we will all miss her," the letter said, "and especially you, but I know you'll carry on. Your own personal philosophy will make you do that. I shall never forget the beautiful truths you taught me. Wherever I am, or how far apart we may be, I shall always remember that you taught me to smile and to take whatever comes like a man." I read and reread that letter. It seemed as if he were there beside me, speaking to me. He seemed to be saying to me, "Why don't you do what you taught me to do? Carry on, no matter what happens. Hide your private sorrows under a